Everything changed on a quiet Thursday afternoon when my phone rang while I was replacing an air handler outside a small office building in Knoxville. I almost let it go to voicemail. The screen showed Haley's name, and we hadn't spoken in weeks except through our attorneys. When I answered, there was no greeting. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. I leaned against my work van, already expecting another question about paperwork or the house. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, I couldn't find the words. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "It's Ethan's." The world around me kept moving. Cars passed. Someone nearby started a leaf blower. My coworker called my name from the roof. Everything sounded strangely distant. Our divorce wasn't even final yet. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle between us. There was nothing left to ask. That phone call didn't end my marriage. It simply confirmed what I had refused to admit for months, that our marriage had died long before any judge would sign the papers. In that moment, I understood I hadn't been losing my wife recently. I'd been losing her for a very long time. We had been married for 7 years, living in a modest brick house on the north side of Knoxville, Tennessee. It wasn't anything fancy, but every room carried the marks of projects we'd tackled together. I worked full-time as an HVAC technician, crawling through attics in the summer and freezing on rooftops during the winter. In the evenings, I delivered groceries a few nights a week because we had promised each other we'd pay off our mortgage before turning 40. It was exhausting, but I believed we were building something permanent. Haley worked mornings at a veterinary clinic. She loved animals, and I admired the patience she showed with nervous owners and injured pets. A couple of years earlier, she had also started working evening shifts at a local wine bar. At first, the extra income seemed like a smart decision. Then the schedule slowly became something else. She started talking more about reconnecting with old friends. Dylan, her ex-boyfriend from college, suddenly came up in conversations again. There were also new names I had never heard before, people from the bar or friends of friends who always seemed to be organizing dinners, concerts, or weekend trips. Every time I admitted feeling uncomfortable, she smiled and told me I was imagining problems that didn't exist. I wanted to believe her. Whenever she came home late or canceled another evening together, I convinced myself that trust meant ignoring the doubts. Looking back now, I realize I spent months defending the very lies that were quietly pulling our marriage apart. Everything shifted because of a phone call from my cousin Grant. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had just finished replacing a compressor when he asked if I had a minute to talk. His voice sounded unusually careful. He told me he had been in Chattanooga that morning for a supplier meeting when he noticed someone who looked exactly like Haley walking through the downtown waterfront district. She had told me she was covering an extra shift at the wine bar, so I laughed and said he must have mistaken someone else for her. Grant didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "I took a couple of pictures because something didn't feel right." A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. The first photo showed Haley crossing the street, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. The second one hit harder. She was holding hands with a man I had never seen before. Grant later learned his name was Ethan. I stared at those pictures for a long time. Suddenly, every late shift, every canceled dinner, every weekend she claimed to be helping with wine distributor events began lining up into one clear timeline. Dylan had never been the whole story. Maybe he had simply been the distraction while someone else remained hidden. That afternoon, I stopped searching for innocent explanations. I wasn't angry yet. I was simply finished arguing with reality. The evidence in front of me demanded something I had avoided for months, accepting that the marriage I believed I was protecting no longer truly existed. I never confronted Haley about the photographs. There wasn't any point. The answers I had been chasing were already sitting in my phone, and no conversation was going to change what they showed. The next morning, instead of calling her, I called a divorce attorney. By the end of the week, I had my first consultation, opened a separate bank account, and started moving my paycheck there. I updated my direct deposits, reviewed every joint bill, and made copies of financial records I hadn't looked at in years. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure I could stand on my own when everything became official. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still left for work before sunrise, still delivered groceries a few evenings each week, and still answered Haley's occasional texts with short, polite replies. She seemed relieved that I wasn't asking questions anymore. I think she mistook my silence for denial, maybe even hope. The truth was exactly the opposite. Something inside me had gone quiet. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. For months, I had been trying to rescue a marriage that only one of us still believed in. Once I accepted that reality, every decision became surprisingly simple. I stopped checking when she would be home. I stopped wondering who she was with. I stopped imagining conversations that would somehow fix everything. Internally, I had already walked away. The divorce papers weren't filed yet, but in my mind the marriage had already ended. All that remained was giving the legal process enough time to catch up with what my heart had finally accepted. Once the attorney started preparing the paperwork, I settled into a routine of watching instead of reacting. Every day seemed to confirm that I had made the right decision. Haley began taking more frequent trips to Nashville, always with an explanation ready before I even asked. She said the wine bar was expanding its supplier network and that she had been chosen to meet distributors across the state. Months earlier, I would have believed every word. Now I simply nodded and let her tell the story she had rehearsed. Her phone never left her hand anymore. If it buzzed, she stepped outside to answer it. At night, she placed it face down on the nightstand instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter like she used to. The smallest habits often reveal the biggest changes. What struck me most wasn't the secrecy. It was the way she talked about the future. She discussed vacations she wanted to take, career opportunities she hoped to pursue, and apartments she had looked at online. Every sentence sounded as though I had already disappeared from her life, even though we were still legally married and living under the same roof. Meanwhile, Grant quietly kept helping me. Without interfering, he managed to uncover hotel reservations showing that Haley and Ethan had spent several weekends together months before we officially separated. Seeing those dates erased the last remaining doubt. The affair hadn't begun after our marriage failed. It had become one of the reasons our marriage failed in the first place. I never planned some dramatic confrontation because I knew it wouldn't change anything. People who spend months lying rarely confess just because they're cornered. Instead, I focused on closing one chapter of my life as cleanly as possible. While Haley was away on what she claimed was another business trip to Nashville, I rented a storage unit using her own information, packed every one of her personal belongings with care, and moved them there. I didn't damage anything or throw anything away. I simply made sure everything she owned would be waiting for her somewhere other than our house. The following weekend, she attended her cousin's engagement party with relatives from both sides of the family. My attorney had coordinated everything in advance. Right in the middle of the gathering, a process server approached her politely and handed her the divorce papers. I wasn't there to watch it happen. I didn't need to be. A few hours later, my phone began buzzing with messages from people asking whether the rumors were true. The affair didn't stay private for long. Once relatives compared stories, the timeline became impossible to ignore. Friends discovered that the marriage had been unraveling long before anyone admitted it. Co-workers from the veterinary clinic and the wine bar quietly connected dates, trips, and excuses that suddenly made perfect sense. I never posted anything online or tried to defend myself. The truth had a way of spreading without any help from me, and I saw no reason to chase after it once it had finally caught up with everyone else. A few days after the divorce papers were served, Haley called and asked if we could meet. She said there were things she needed to explain face to face. We agreed to meet at my office during my lunch break. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and the confidence she had carried for months seemed to have disappeared. She sat across from me without speaking for nearly a minute, twisting a paper cup between her hands. Finally, she looked up. "I left you for Ethan," she said quietly. "I should have admitted that from the beginning." I didn't interrupt. She took a shaky breath before continuing. "I'm pregnant. It's his baby." The room remained completely silent. Months earlier, those words would have shattered me. Now they simply confirmed everything I already knew. She explained that she had planned to tell me after her first ultrasound because she didn't know how to leave our marriage without everyone seeing her as the villain. She thought waiting would somehow soften what she had done. I listened without arguing or asking questions. There was nothing left to understand. Every missing piece had already fallen into place. When she finished, tears rolled down her face as she whispered that she had never wanted things to happen this way. I stood, wished her and the baby good health, and thanked her for finally telling the truth. Then I walked her to the office door, shook her hand one last time, and returned to work. It was the quietest goodbye of my life, and somehow it was also the easiest. After that conversation, I stepped out of Haley's story completely. There was nothing left for me to argue about, and I had no interest in following the chaos that came next. News traveled on its own. A few weeks later, Grant called to tell me that Ethan had disappeared almost as soon as he learned he was going to become a father. The man Haley believed she was building a future with suddenly stopped answering calls, canceled plans, and drifted out of her life as quietly as he had entered it. Not long afterward, I began hearing another version of events. Haley was telling people that I had abandoned her after discovering she was pregnant, leaving out everything that had happened before. For a short time, some people believed her. Then the timeline started catching up. The photographs Grant had taken in Chattanooga, the hotel reservations, and messages that eventually surfaced made it impossible to ignore when the affair had really begun. One by one, those who had questioned my side quietly stopped asking questions. I never felt the need to defend myself publicly. The facts did that without my help. My attorney finalized the remaining paperwork, and before long the divorce was officially complete. I signed the last document, shook my lawyer's hand, and drove straight to an HVAC service call waiting across town. Life didn't pause because my marriage had ended. Customers still needed broken air conditioners repaired, bills still arrived every month, and morning still began before sunrise. The difference was that I was finally moving forward without carrying someone else's decisions on my shoulders anymore. Almost a year passed before I saw Haley again. I had accepted a weekend HVAC job in Lexington, Kentucky, helping another technician cover a busy stretch of summer service calls. On my way home, I stopped at a grocery store to grab something for dinner. As I pushed my cart toward the entrance, I noticed a woman standing near the cart return with a stroller. It took me a second to recognize her. Haley looked older than I remembered, not because of wrinkles or gray hair, but because life had settled heavily on her shoulders. Her daughter slept quietly beneath a light blanket, completely unaware of the world around her. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. She gave me a small nod. I returned it. There were no apologies left to offer and no explanations worth repeating. Everything that could have been said had already been said months earlier. We stood there for only a few seconds before she adjusted the stroller and continued toward the parking lot. I walked inside and picked up the groceries I needed. It was one of the calmest encounters of my adult life. Driving home that evening, I realized I didn't feel anger, bitterness, or satisfaction. I wasn't happy that her relationship with Ethan had collapsed, and I wasn't sad either. Her life had become the result of the choices she had made, just as mine had become the result of mine. We had reached the same intersection from different directions, but only one of us was still looking backward. I kept driving toward home, grateful that peace had quietly replaced every emotion I once believed would never leave me. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see while I was living through it. I spent too much time believing that if I worked harder, trusted more, or sacrificed a little longer, I could save a marriage that only one person still wanted. The truth was much simpler. By the time I realized what was happening, Haley had already built a different future without me. For a while, I thought betrayal had destroyed my life. It hadn't. It forced me to let go of a future that had been falling apart long before I was willing to admit it. The divorce wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one I finally controlled myself. These days, I still work as an HVAC technician. I still believe in showing up early, keeping my word, and building things that last. The difference is that I no longer confuse loyalty with ignoring reality. Sometimes the hardest goodbye isn't a failure. Sometimes it's the first honest step toward peace. Losing the life I thought I wanted gave me the chance to build one that truly belonged to me.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.